watch this at a later point in time. There were a few people that were unable to attend today. So I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan. He'll do the heavy lifting today. So with that, Jonathan, I'm going to let you get started.
Thanks. So I feel like I should be like when you call a phone company and just warn you that this call is being recorded for training purposes. So normally on these we ask people to be on mute. I'm not going to ask people to be on mute because people will ask questions. But in addition to that, WebEx has a really cool little chat feature. So if you're one of these folks that, not everyone's always comfortable on these big calls asking questions, if you want to type them into the chat feature, I can try to answer them as they come up in there as well. So I want to invite people to use that and see how effective that might be. So welcome, everybody. The purpose of this is it's an interactive training session, and as Sue said, about Revit project management. There is no Revit training in this. If you've never opened Revit, that's fine. You're going to see any screenshots of Revit. It has nothing to do with that. For purposes of kind of background and introduction, I know a number of the people on the call. I see a bunch of names I recognize, but for those I don't. So I'm Jonathan Merin. I'm a senior project manager in Boston. I've been with Nelson since 2006. I've been using Revit since 2001. And in my time here, we have been using Revit in Boston since 2007. So about 5+ years now. Over that time period, we have done everything from moving a door to 500,000 to 750,000 square feet. We've done huge projects, small projects. I spent nearly 5 years on Bank of America. We've done a lot of Bank of America work in Revit. We've done a lot of work for Budget and a lot of work for Google. We do an awful lot of landlord work, because I know folks out there that are doing a lot of landlord work. So we run the gamut. We've done ground-up buildings, and like I said, we've done things as small as move a door. So we don't really look at Revit as a choice here any longer. It's just how Boston operates. 90+% of our work is in Revit. The only that ever gets done in CAD, it's special circumstance usually, and to be honest, most of my folks complain if we tell them they have to use CAD. They're not real happy doing it. So, as most aware, I guess, to Revit is a Nelson initiative and decision. So this is not really filtered around the idea that we're going to necessarily convince you to use Revit, I suppose. I think it's more about trying to help you and help you understand your role as a project manager in a Revit project and help you understand how the team needs to come together. This is the first of what may end up being a couple of sessions. I'm just going to move forward here, maybe. This is today's agenda. There's kind of three big parts to this, which are what we call the facts, build Revit team, and constructing Revit workplace. I intend to have future sessions, maybe once a month. There are several other topics, including deal with consultants, kind of specific project process things that Revit brings up. But the whole idea around this is to talk about a lot of the process differences between a Revit project and a CAD project. The other thing I sort of wanted to throw out there at the beginning to understand is that I understand that Boston, in some ways, we're in a different point than a lot of you folks are. And there are some things that we do, and there may be some examples that I give that I try to adjust to talk about when you're first starting out, because we have 20+ strong Revit users. So we make certain decisions around here that are 5 years into the process, and so certain things and certain, I would say, biases that we have are based on that experience and that structure and the fact that we're not making a choice any longer. This is just what we do. So we're going to color it and back to kind of when we first started and try to talk to it from that direction on things. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Facts. And these are for lack of a better term, 6 statements that I came up with that are things that I think about every time I sit down and I put together a work plan, or I come up with a fee, or I look how we're going to staff a project. And I found that these things pretty much apply across the board, and so I wanted to talk about each of them. The first one that is up there, which is change is easy, creation is hard, is more important than the other 5 put together. And if there's nothing else that you get out of today, this is the one that I would say you want to focus on. And to me, having done CAD projects for a while before coming in the Revit world, is something that is the biggest difference as far as I'm concerned. In a environment, even in a hand drafting environment prior to that, project manager, the thing that you were most concerned about is change. You want your client to go ahead and lock down that plan and not change it and leave it alone, so that we can go ahead and do the ceiling plan, and then we can go ahead and do the elevations, and we can go ahead and operate the design. And we all understand that that's a very idealistic scenario that never happens. That's the goal in how you're planning out the project. Actually look at it completely the opposite in Revit. We look at it as we're going to change all the way. And what's much harder than changing is the actual creation. So the beginning is hard. Starting from nothing is hard. But once we have something, we all want to just keep producing more and more because we can change it very easily. And so we're never afraid to kind of move forward on something. What's more difficult is just completely adding and starting from scratch. And so it's a very different philosophy, and we're going to kind of talk a lot about that. The second thing, and I think this has a lot to do with staffing and it has a lot to do with how you build your team, is that Revit knowledge and project knowledge are not the same thing. And this is something that has become kind of a trend in the industry where a lot of young folks come in, they have a lot of great Revit skills, they have a lot of ability to build things in Revit, and they may not have a whole lot of actual knowledge as to how to do things. And John Kells is on the call, and he might talk about this a lot actually, because there come times where we start looking at what folks are doing and realize that, they don't really know what they're building. They're just building something. And a good friend of mine used to say that the problem with the box is there are no physics in the box. And so we do not allow Revit knowledge to fool us that someone actually understands what it is that they're truly modeling and what they're building. With that being said, there are ways that using Revit can help you learn about how a project comes together, because you are dealing with parts of it you might not have dealt with in a more traditional 2D environment. We have to be very careful in how we evaluate roles of people on teams. The one is, if you can draw it in 2D in CAD, then you can draw it in 2D in Revit, and the effort really isn't any different. I'm going to pick on you for a second. So John doesn't actually know AutoCAD. When he came to Nelson, he had been using MyStation for what, John, 13 years?
Enough years.
Yeah. So John never worked in AutoCAD, and
well, I used it up through 97.
Yeah. Well, never sounds better. So he is someone who Nelson, we put in Revit, and he has learned to draw 2D in Revit. And really, it's the same as drawing in CAD, and most of what you draw in 2D that you would draw in CAD, whether we're talking about details, whether we're talking about some elevation work, is really exactly the same. And so if we start looking at it that way, again, that helps to understand effort of what certain things take for actually planning them out. The one is cheating is encouraged, and this is one that sort of has evolved over the years, is to get the project done. We all understand that. You cheat. And we're going to talk a lot about that, but you have to understand, what am I building, what am I not building, what am I actually going to need to get this project done. Not what can I do, but what do I need to do. And sometimes you're going to cheat, and that's a simple reality of it. We cheat all the time. It depends on who your contractor is, it depends on who your client is, it depends on what the expectations are, but we construct the team, we construct the work plan based on understanding how much we can cheat on a particular project, rather than this idea, and this idea is very prevalent kind of in the the world and among people who do Revit a lot of, oh, we have to model everything and we can do this and we can do that and so on and so forth. And Revit does not do projects. People do projects. Really important. A lot of people still to this day, and I'm surprised when I run into it, but I do all the time, think that Revit does the project. People do the project, and the people have to run the tool. Revit is the tool, obviously, and it's not doing any work for you. There are many things that it does do, but for everything it does do, there's something that we still have to do as the folks using the tool. And so the plan has to reflect that, the fees to reflect that, the schedule has to reflect that. And then the next one, it's about design, not production, but if we don't make any money, we won't be around to design. The designers are going to want to keep designing. They're always going to want to keep designing. We have to manage the design. We have to manage the design as part of the Revit process. It's a different schedule. There are different milestones in that, but we still have to do it, and it's still very important. Revit gives the idea of, oh, you literally design till the days the drawings go out. I can tell you that doesn't work very well. You might want to try it, but it's not terribly effective. Okay. Any questions on any of these before we move on? Okay. So, how do we build a Revit team? And how does the Revit team differ from the traditional project team? So I went and I laid a very quick traditional project team, and obviously I understand if it's if you're moving a door, all these people on the left might be one person. If you're 2.5 million square feet, you may have multiple project designers, you may have multiple project architects, you certainly will have a lot of production support. This more is to introduce the idea that on a Revit project team we have an additional role. And again, all of those roles could be one person depending on the size of the project, but someone still has to be this role. And the role we're talking about is the Revit Model Manager, which we're RMM for short. This is a critical role when you staff a Revit project. So a couple of basic questions, I think. So what does the RMM do? Most important role of the RMM, the Revit Model Manager, is that they own the Revit model. So what does that mean? Well, your entire project, as many of you probably know, is one file. It's a single Revit model, produces all of the drawings, produces everything that has to do with the project. Unfortunately, in a 2D environment, you can see everything that ends up on your drawing in some ways. In the world, you can't see 90% of what actually ends up on the drawings. So you have all kinds of things that can go on in that model that you won't discover until you're in construction and all of a sudden somebody makes a change and you realize that none of your walls actually go to the slab above. What the Model Manager's job is to police all of that. Someone who goes through the model, it is someone who on a regular basis look for the constructability of the model itself, not the project. That's going through and making sure that the walls are going to the deck, or that, and when I say walls going to the deck, I mean literally in the model, the walls reach the deck, which they don't, and if you don't set them that way. Making sure that we had a really good thing, and it happens to us all the time, and with a Revit Model Manager, we still make this mistake. We had an issue on a project that just went out that someone had been doing an elevation that had a bunch of wooden board on it, and without getting overly technical, the way they had built these boards in Revit meant that you had to individually edit every single board, and needed to change a fill pattern so that it looked differently in the elevation, and what had been built as the board should have been a family that was replicated, where you change one board, they all change, and you're done, and your change takes 10 seconds. Unfortunately, we built it incorrectly. Every single one of them was an individual, and it took actually took me 2 hours to go through and change all of these boards, which obviously wasn't a great use of time, but needed to be done. That's the kind of thing the Revit Model Manager is looking for. So what kind of teammate should be the Revit Model Manager? Obviously, kind of goes with the next question, which is, do I just find the best Revit person in the office and make them the Revit Model Manager? You may, But there's some very critical criteria for this role. And the first criteria that I think is the most important is it has to be on the project. And that's where we sort of bring DTS into the conversation. DTS project is in Minneapolis or it's in Chicago and you have Tim or you have Brandon actually a member of the project team is not going to be a good candidate for the Revit model manager. There'd be a great to support that person, to help them if there are technical issues with the model or even if there are questions or things that they can help them work through. But from a day-to-day standpoint, it is not the right person to be the Revit model manager. You need someone who understands the project intimately, someone who can work with the project architect, work with the project manager, and they know what they're looking for. When they go through the model, they understand that in the example that I gave, all of these wooden slats are supposed to be the same, and so needed to have built them as a single family. They understand that we have a project where, I don't know, there's a waffle slab, and so the walls in the project need to go not to the underside edge of the waffle slab, but all the way up into the coffers. They understand that this is what is actually going on in this project, so they're not someone who just comes in on the outside once a week, looks at the thing, and has to figure out what the design is about. Okay? That's a critical characteristic of the person who has this role. And again, sort of going back to our original team, okay, it could be all the above. So if you have only one person doing the project, that person is the model manager, and that's fine. But we need to designate somebody as it. What we tend to do here is we designate someone at the beginning as when we're building the team, and we say this person, in addition to whatever their other role is the person who owns the model. We also make sure that's the person who's sending the model out. So if we need to send the model to a consultant, or if we need to occasionally send it to a contractor or the client, it's always that person sending out the model. That person is the one monitoring the model links, because we work with exclusively Revit consultants, particularly on larger projects, and so most of the time we have 4, 5, 6, 7 models linked together, and someone is managing those links, and that is, again, the Revit model manager. It's really not a role that DTS is going to be able to fill on most projects. It does need to be someone who has experience in Revit. They don't need to be the best Revit person in the office. It needs to be someone who can go into the model and can evaluate how some things are built. And if there are technical issues, if there are even content issues, they can certainly seek out DTS for assistance, and DTS will be happy to help them out, but it's still that person is who owns it. Does that sort of make sense, or are there any questions on that rule that anybody might have? Okay. Let's talk about the rest of the team. And one of the ideas out there is the entire team needs to know Revit, and everyone on the team needs to be able to use Revit. And that's just not true. I mean, perfect world, it is true, but it's realistic. Just to kind of give everybody some information, the folks we have here in Boston don't know Revit. 2 design directors who don't know it. We have both senior designers who don't know it. Obviously, these folks do a lot of valuable work on the work that we do. None of them can do much anything in Revit. It's a management task to be able to make sure that they can still do their roles as part of the process we need to accomplish our project. But it's because somebody doesn't know Revit doesn't mean they can't still be a valuable member of the team. So when we're building the team and staffing the team, we need to ensure that the Revit model manager knows Revit. We need to make sure that the folks that are actively, as we call it, the production, which is a little bit of a misnomer, but the folks building the model obviously need to know Revit. There are other roles on the team that really don't. And what I do, Steve Oppenheimer, who's the other senior PM in Boston here, does not know Revit. I don't even think he knows CAD, to be honest with you. So it's not a critical part, but you do need to be able to understand it. And that's a lot of where today's presentation and the future ones comes from, and that's part of what we're trying to work towards. So when you're looking for how you're filling your team, you need to make sure that if they work on the model or if they are going to be the Revit model manager, that they are fluent in it. Other folks, not necessarily. And the best training, and we've trained a lot of people here in Boston, we've brought in, the best training for Revit is working on Revit projects. And the best way to train people example, is to team up somebody who knows what they're doing with someone who's not quite as advanced and have them work together. And that's been a very effective way for people to get better, because repetition is the best thing that ends up building Revit skills, and working on actual projects is where you sort of get the experience. So before I go any further, I just want to stop for a second. Is there any questions at all on the Revit team, or anything that anyone would like to know further? Everybody on a Friday. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. This is Eric in Chicago. I would like to add one thing that you kind of touched on, and I think is critically important, is that the understanding of what this technology can do is, for a majority of us that are in project teams, understanding of it is much more important than being an advanced individual user in the technology. I think that's critically important.
I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that we do here when we for people is look for a certain way that they think more than we look for an ability to actually use Revit. We obviously, when we find folks that have significant Revit backgrounds and skills, that's a wonderful thing. But even in Boston, where Revit started here, it was invented over in Waltham, about 10 miles outside Boston. So we have a pretty big population of Revit users here relative to most cities. I know a lot of cities are still struggling to have folks learning it. But here, when we get tons of candidates, a lot of them know it. They've trained, they've had this or that, and maybe they've worked on it, but they may not have done projects on it. So what we're looking for is a way of thinking and an understanding of how the tool thinks, and a way of understanding kind of the process, as much as I know I need to click this tool, or I need to do this, or I need to do that, because the mechanics are something that we can teach you, and you will learn the more you go through the process. And the other part of it that I would suggest is that as the Revit interface is kind of fixed, so I know in the CAD world it's an extremely customizable interface versus the Revit interface. For those that have seen it or are familiar, it pretty much is what it is. It was developed a long time ago. It came from Softimage, and then later on they went to the Ribbon, which is what we have now. But it's there's not a customization. So, but in spite of that, every company has very different standards of how they use it. So there are different BIM standards, there are different standards for how you build families. All of this kind of information is very different in every company. So regardless of what happens, you still need to teach people all of this. There is a part to get up to speed. When you bring someone new on, it's just, oh, I know how to use Revit. So I think that's a really, really good point. Any other comments or questions?
Hey, Louis, can you?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, the one thing that I remember, it's been honestly about a year and a half now since I've really used it, but there seem to be two groups of people when you use Revit. There's the people that know how to put this together and know how to do the drawings, but then there's people that are probably more at doing the family creation. I didn't know if you've experienced it or not.
That's an excellent point. We have found that the people that can build families can do sets, but the people who can do sets can't necessarily build families. So we have found that if you have the experience and the ability to build complex families, to do a lot of 3D, you likely can do the technical aspect of building a set. But what it doesn't mean is that you know how to build a set. So it doesn't mean that you know necessarily what a good foundation looks like, or a correct demolition plan, or you can write good notes, or you can do any of that. So you can do the operational part of building a set, but you don't necessarily have the actual architectural interiors experience to understand what a good detail is. Would you agree with that? I'm on John Kells today.
I agree with it. This is not John. This is Daryl.
Yeah, Daryl's on too. Good. So between John and Daryl,
and I was on mute because I'm multitasking, eating my lunch.
But John and Daryl are examples. John and Daryl are two project architects in Boston, are two senior architects, and both know Revit. But I think that's a big thing we found here is, it masks things. So we have folks who can build wonderful content, but don't really know what a good elevation looks like, and that's something we continue to look at here. It sort of maxes the ability. I would say finding people who can build good content, though, is very difficult, even here. We have probably, I know more than 2 or 3 really good content builders in this office. We have a lot of people who can build very simple 2D content, but if you're looking for real 3D, operable, parametric, where build one table and it can change sizes to all different sizes, we have 2 to 3 people who are really good, and that's about it, really. It's a good question. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, if they come up, please feel free to voice up as we keep going. So, talk about constructing a work plan. And these are the typical project phases everybody's familiar with. Each phase sort of has a different idea as it applies to Revit. And I wanted to start in survey due diligence because this is really extremely important. And I did something recently called the Gilded Osprey theorem, which has a little bit of a story behind it. And it actually ends up applying to everything we're doing, and it sort of goes back to the cheating comment from before. And it comes from a very good friend of mine who I've known for a long time, who back 10 years ago when they first started getting into Revit in the company he was at, the first projects they were doing was they were building a 17-story condo tower, and the developer that they were working for, his logo was a osprey, I guess. And one day he came home, we were roommates at the time, and he said, get this. I said, what? He said, we built an osprey. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, we built the osprey in Revit, and we put it on the top of the building because the owner wanted to see this as his big statement to himself that he's got his big osprey in gilded bronze or something on the top of the building. Really, I said, how long did that take? He said, oh, we had some work on it. It took like a week. And I said, well, that's interesting. And I thought to myself, well, if we were doing it here and if we were doing it now, we would probably have someone Photoshop it onto the top of the building in 2 minutes at the end of the presentation right before it was going out the door. We wouldn't take the time to build a 3-dimensional gilded osprey. But what happens with Revit, and this is sort of something we've seen across the board, is if you can, people tend to do it. So, we can do this cool thing, so we'll do it. Where it starts in the first place, I feel, is that in survey due diligence. And the problem is everybody goes, oh, well, it's Revit, so we need all this information, so we need to go out and we need to do an exhaustive survey. We need to make sure that we have every sill height and every head height, and we make sure that we've met the place to the inch, and we need to make sure that we got every little fraction of this thing measured. If you're in a full floor gut demolition and you're in a complicated building, that may be true. You may be trying to build a very complicated existing condition model. If you're doing a carpet and paint job, the odds are a lot of information there that you just don't need. And when you're playing it and when you're giving instructions and when you're thinking about how long is the survey going to take, it's no different from a CAD environment. We do a lot of projects where they take a core and shell of a building and we just plop a stair in. The stair may not be right. It's in the room. It's representational effect. There's a stair there for egress purposes and when we're doing our egress diagram, but we know it's wrong. We didn't measure the handrail. We didn't measure the riser and the tread. We just plopped something that looks right. If all we're doing is replacing carpet, always just show some windows. We make sure that in they're dimensioned correct. Sill height's wrong, it's wrong. We don't bother to measure it if we know that all we're doing is carpet and paint. So, on some level, you have to understand in Revit that just because you can model the studs, because you can model the window frame, just because you can model every single baluster on the stairwell, doesn't mean that you need to. This is where the difference between knowing how to do a project and knowing how to use Revit oftentimes comes into conflict, because we have a lot of very talented people who come in and they're great modelers and they can do all of this stuff. It takes time, but they can do it. And so their initial inclination is, oh, I want to be accurate, I want to impress everybody, so I'm going to build this incredible existing condition model. Well, it sounds like a great idea until you realize you just spent 2 weeks building a model of a 5,000 square foot space. We have to be able to make judgments at the beginning to say, this is what we really need to do this project. We may need ceilings. We take everything, all of the existing conditions, and we put them into Revit. We don't work off CAD backgrounds. Everything that we do in Revit, sometimes we'll use the CAD as an underlay and we'll draw on top of it, and that's fine. But ultimately, it is all built in Revit, but we only build what we have to build.
So to expand on what Jonathan just said, one of the things that I find useful is to just take some time to walk around the office, take over people's shoulders, and if I see something being modeled in 3D, I'll actually question, is this something that we need to have modeled in 3D? Sometimes there's a very good reason for it, like it's we just had an instance where there was a stair, and that stair was going to show up in a half dozen different elevations from different angles. So modeling that stair in 3D was actually a time saver. But if that stair wasn't going to show up in multiple elevations, there would have been no reason for that to be modeled in 3D. Would have been a wasted effort and time not well spent. So getting up and taking a look at what the project teams are actually working on, especially if you're not fluent in Revit, is a very worthwhile exercise.
And if you're not looking at it that detailed and you're just thinking about it from a planning exercise, just think about how much time normally would you allot for a survey. And if normally you believe that the survey of that space is going to take 8 hours, then it's going to take 8 hours. And producing it in Revit won't take any longer than producing it in CAD if you make sure that you're only actually creating what you need to create. It's as simple as that. So whatever initial thoughts on it are, that's probably the truth. If you only have 4 hours to do the survey and create the model, then there is a way to do it in 4 hours. It means that you're going to get less detail, and what you have to communicate to your teams is we need to make sure that we're very cognizant of what we are and aren't building. We only need to do what we need to do to get the job done. Any questions on that? I know it's a little bit of a subject. Okay. So, schematic design, design development. One of the things that begins to happen in an environment is these two things start to kind of merge together. And one of the things in general that will start to happen is your schematic design time frame, your design development time frame, and your construction document time frame will start to become much more even in terms of a third, a third, a third. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of the reason is that you have some more things up front that you need to do, whether it involves building more of the building, but specifically you may be a designer who is looking at multiple options. You may want to have kind of diagrammatic floor plans. All of these things Revit actually produces with it. You should not be having your teams using Photoshop to color floor plans. Revit can produce colored floor plans, and they can be actually attached to the programming model. There's information that can be embedded there, and then you can actually change it, and you can have multiple design options within. So rather than sort of the CAD environment where you might have either multiple files or you might have a bunch of plans kind of in one space in the CAD file, in Revit you literally have multiple versions of the model with itself. And you can eventually pick the one that is the one that you want to proceed with. All of this is sort of a change because when your designers sort of get used to it, they start to realize that they can stretch a little longer because there is less coordination on the back end that has to happen when they make changes. What that ends up doing, as I said earlier, is it evens out the SD, DD, and CD phases so that from a timeline standpoint, you end up spending about the same amount of time. The CD phase gets compressed. The SD phase and the DD phases get a little bit longer from where they normally were. Your overall schedule tends to stay about the same, but the breakdown of phases is what starts to change. That's something that you try to communicate to your client. It's not always going to work. Sometimes the client is going to set that and say, well, this is what you do. If that's the case, then what ends up happening is you have overstaffing the SD and DD phases to get more work done in a shorter period, and you understaff the CD phase because you have more time to sort of finish up. That is something that used to happen, I think, very commonly. I think now we've been a lot more successful at sort of educating our clients, and I think that I feel like many of the clients in Boston have become more used to people working in Revit because most of the large firms in Boston work in Revit, so it's sort of become the understanding that project phases are shifting. Things that you're going to accomplish during this time, you're going to be doing more than floor plans, because of course Revit's going to give you the option to create some 3D. You're going to be doing more than just space planning, because of course submissions will develop. We may have ceiling plans develop. We start ceiling plans very early. We start them earlier than probably most. In fact, one of the things that will happen on a project, on a typical project, is once we have a floor plan that's even close to somewhere, I will say to the team, okay, I want you to go ahead and start put ceilings in all enclosed rooms. And again, why? Because we can change it. If it's wrong and we have to change it later, that's fine. But through something in the model, so we have something there we can start to work off of. It means we can get stuff to our consultants quicker. It means that if we're using a lighting designer, we can get it to the lighting designer quicker so that they can work on it. We start power plans very early in the process, especially if it's a client where we sort of know they have standards where it's, this is the typical conference room gets, this is what an office gets, so on and so forth. We start pop those things in there because, again, in Revit, if the wall moves, the outlets are going to move with it. Worry about having to go back and coordinate that later. So more things into the model earlier that you might be able to do. The other thing this does is it helps account for downtime. So for example, you go to a client and you present, let's say test fit, and the client's looking at the test fit. Well, what's your team doing while you're doing that? They're not anything. And if it's a situation where it's a large project and you haven't been able to, you don't have people reassigned to other things temporarily, these things you have them work on. Start putting in ceilings, start putting in power, start set up sheets, doing all of the things that need to happen for the CD set without worrying that we're going to spend time having to move outlets later because they'll just move with the walls. So it changes a little bit of how we think about it. We try to do as much information as possible as early as we can possibly do it, and we sort of move on from that, and we anticipate the fact it's going to change, and we actually embrace the change. The time you get to construction documents, I sort of threw these percentages together, and they're not exact, and every project is different, and, John are on, and I'm sure they have examples of places where we diverted from these a little bit, but in general, I think about it as, by the time we're at CDs, our plans are at about 90%, believe it or not. Door schedule, partition type, schedule information, we're about halfway there. Design elevations, we're about 80% of the way there. Design elevations, 15%. Details that have cost impact, we try to be about 75%. Typical details, maybe 15%, because maybe we haven't put them all in yet, or we haven't had a chance to figure out exactly which ones we're using. And we think of it as the final drawing set. We don't design it and then figure out how to document it. The drawing set is part of the conversation from day one because it's the same model. We're always thinking about it in those terms. We're going to need to be to document it at the end, and how can we, particularly when there's downtime, and particularly when folks are not necessarily working on something that is active to the design, how can we give them things to do that will help us in the long run? Because remember, some things that you commonly do that we don't end up having to do. So we don't have tag coordination. we don't worry about it. We don't worry that the elevation tag is going to match the elevation. Revit's going to do it automatically, and we don't think about it. We don't worry about whether or not, as I said earlier, an outlet has moved with the wall. We know wall moves, the outlet is going to move. We know that if we slide a door over, door schedule is going to update. If we change the width of that door, if we change the height of that door, the door schedule is going to change with it. We check all these things, and of course, we all have of reality on QA/QC that we'd love to be doing it all along, and we're supposed to be doing it all along. It becomes extra important that you do it all along the process in a Revit project, because there's a lot of things that are being put into the model, and what happens is, again, the fusion of the folks who know Revit versus the folks who know how to do projects. In our world, it's someone like John or Daryl who's going in and going, okay, I need to make sure that that partition has been called out as the right partition type. What they don't have to worry about is that the tag is correct, because the tag is going to reflect whatever partition is selected in the model. But they're going to go and make sure that we're actually chose the right partition for this usage. And so that's kind of the difference between the Revit model manager and maybe the project architect, or, depending on, again, if the roles are compressed on a project, maybe it's the PM and PA the same person. But, in a large project in our office, John or Daryl or someone like that would be doing that work and making sure that we have the right hardware set picked out. We don't worry that, it's going to have hardware set, but worry that it'll be the correct one, and that part of the coordinating is done. Other tips I would say about CDs, and I wanted to say something about elevations because Revit does us all an injustice about elevations. Injustice is this. Revit, by its nature, is, okay, you drop the elevation tag and it produces an elevation. The problem is that the elevations that it produces are usually not visible in their native state with no other work. I would say the most time that we spend in CDs is actually drawing elevations. We spend more time doing that even than drawing details. And the reason is because a lot of the elevations need a lot of line work on top of them to get to what that we actually want to see in an elevation as architects and interiors people. It's more time than it takes to draw an elevation in CAD. In fact, it's less time because Revit will give you the boundary of what you need. It's going to give you a lot of your stuff in 2D in elevation. It'll give you heights. It'll give you that window in 2D so that you've got that. So some of what you get will be correct, but the line weights are not good. There's quite a bit of work to go through and make sure that you've got a nice heavy line around your elevation. There's a lot of work to make sure that things recede into depth or don't. So there's a bit of 2D line work that goes into elevation. So that was something I wanted to address because I do think there can be a notion that, Revit is producing elevations, and so that's great. I'm not going to spend much time on these. You're still not going to spend as much time if you have to draw them from scratch, but you're going to spend more time than you think. And that is a huge part of where we are when we're doing CDs here, is we spend a lot of time on elevations. A couple other things I want to pull off this slide. This can be 3D as well as 2D. We make a lot of that. There are a lot of cases where we'll have a specialty item. In the we just did, there's a room that looks like the fuselage of an airplane, and we had someone here build a 3D of that ceiling, and we were able to just take that 3D and slap it in the CD set and say, here you go, guys. We didn't spend a lot of time on it other than that because we realized that was the most descriptive thing of the form we could do, and spending a lot of time drawing sections and things like that. So if you produce that, if your team has that, think about that as a way to actually document a part of the project. Another thing that I want to highlight on here is that depending on where you are in the CDs, you might be looking to redline parts of the project, you might be looking to redline individual sheets. We sort of start as parts of the project, so again, using that line footage as an example. We didn't tell that person, we need you to work on the elevation of this. We said, we need you to work on this room. And that meant there was a plan there was an elevation there were a few different pieces. Because again, when you're working in this environment, you're touching all of these different things. when you're to the end, you are going to have some folks who will need to just pick up straight red lines, this is wrong on this sheet or blah, 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 something like that. So that's something to keep in mind. And one other piece, your consultants are not in Revit. It's a very different process. And we're going to do a whole section on consultants later, but if they're working in CAD, you have to get them information generally a lot sooner. It really cuts down on your ability to kind of coordinate and have productive changes. One of the things, John and I just did a project that is about 93,000 square feet, is 5 floors, a waffle slab building that has a lot of exposed ceiling. Because the engineer worked in Revit, we actually were able to put the MEP model inside our model, and our ceiling plans show not just lights and ceilings, but they actually show the ductwork being did. So the whole thing is fully coordinated. So if you can get your consultants to work in Revit, I highly recommend that. I know it's more of a challenge, again, in Boston, because Revit's been around here for a long time. All of the major engineering firms work in Revit. They gripe about it. Most of them don't like it, but when I write an RFP for the engineers, I just say Revit 2012 is required, and if they say something else, I don't consider them. So if it's what you want, you need to make sure you ask for it, and be very specific about the version, because Revit can't go backwards. So engineers working on a previous version, there's no way that your model and their model will work together. You have to be on the exact same version of Revit. So that's sort of an important thing for people to understand. Real quick, furniture, a lot of it has to do with furniture scope. We have started doing some scheduling in Revit where we embed information in the furniture, and then Revit produces a schedule we can use for budgeting and some other things. But the most important thing here is 2D versus 3D. We build a lot of 2D furniture. We build probably 90% of our furniture in 2D. We only build furniture in 3D if for some reason we need for a design purpose, like we're going to do a rendering or we're going to be trying to figure something out based on the piece of furniture that somehow affects the architecture and we want to see an elevation or we want to see something like that. Otherwise, most of your furniture can be built in 2D. Building 3D furniture takes a long time. It is not quick. And it's something you really need to understand. If your team comes to you and says, we need to build this in 3D, assume talking about a couple of days for something as simple as a chair. It's not quick, particularly if the forms are a little more rectilinear, I would say, if they're a little more abstract and a little more curved. There's a lot of work that comes with having to put materials in them so they render correctly. There are great sources of Revit content. I know that the D folks have been working on getting some content together. I don't totally know the status of that, but that kind of comes back. That comes to the cheating thing. You've got to find a way to make it work, and a lot of times that means 2D Revit furniture. So don't be afraid of that. It's completely understandable, useful, and in fact, I recommend it. Sort of to touch on some bidding and CA. So I don't know if you guys find this around the country. We have now started to come up against contractors who BIM. Some build their own BIM models. They get your model. They want to be able to go into it and find all of that extra information that's not showing up on your 2D drawings. Getting all of the legal parts of that from a purely practical part of that for a second, be very, very, very careful. Because again, we all cheat. If you have a project like that, you need to try to establish that with your owner off the bat, whether or not that's going to happen. One of the 2 Biogen projects we're currently doing, the large ones, that was made clear at the very beginning. The contractor was going to examine our model, and the contractor was going to give us notes on the model, not the drawings, the model. So we have had to pretty much increase the fee, increase the staffing do a lot of things we wouldn't normally done because we had to make sure that that model was picture perfect in every way, shape, or form, that everything in it was modeled exactly, everything was 3D, everything had parameters, everything was modeled to the T. And we going in and we built the fee structure and the plan that way. That is not something that you can just do. If you haven't planned for it, it's not going to happen. So it's something that you really have to make sure outside of the project that your client understands what that means. If you're interested in that kind of a BIM process, the contractor understands. Otherwise, I don't recommend sending models to contractors. It really starts to create some problems.
So, Jonathan, Claudia in Minneapolis. So, what does the client think about that? Are they willing to say, we do want this kind of detail, and we're willing to give additional, let you additional services for this?
Yes. In multiple cases, we've come across where it's really been where the client really understands the conversation. Yes, that has been okay. In cases where we don't think the client understands the conversation, we work very hard to talk them out of this idea. And it's because, again, the client doesn't really understand BIM. So we work very hard to educate them on what that really means and why giving the client the model, giving the contractor, the model is not a good idea, because there are always things in that model that are not going to be correct once you really dive into it. So it's really an upfront conversation. We look for it in RFPs. So if an RFP comes out and it says you must do it in Revit, a lot of the times one of the questions we will ask is submitting the model part of doing it in Revit, or what are the submission requirements? And that's become a question we commonly ask now.
It's also something you want to be very careful when you're just first few projects in Revit and you're still becoming familiar with it. It's we've been working with it for years, and it's sort of an eye opener. It's like, okay, that's a different ball of wax, So it's not something you want to enter into lightly, especially if you're just getting up to speed.
Yeah. As soon as you get an RFP that says the work must be done in Revit, I would ask that question. I would say, does that mean that the model will be provided, or simply that we're working in Revit and providing traditional 2D drawings, which is totally fine, and we shouldn't be hesitant for that at all.
Hey, Jonathan, it's Marla Shallett. How are you?
Hey, Marla.
Question for those of us who are not have not done multiple projects in Revit to date.
Sure.
Can you explain, for example, what some of the tasks that have to be done that cause this additional time frame and man hours in getting that model to that point? Reflect what you were talking about as far as it's okay to cheat.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just trying to connect the dots here. So if you can give a couple examples.
I mean, give you some really good examples, actually. So one of the things I was talking about earlier is this idea of whites.
Yeah.
And if you're doing a project where the contractor is going to examine the model, let's say you have a bunch of walls in your project that are studs to the deck with drywall 6 inches above, we model that. We call out, draw the wall, we call out a partition type that is studs to the deck 6 inches above, and then we send the whole wall up to the deck. So if you look at the actual model, what you're going to see is you're going to actually see drywall going all the way to the deck on both sides, because there is an extra step in there to actually show that drywall to only go 6 inches above. Because in the 2D drawings that you produce, there's no place you ever would see that. But if you actually got the model, you would be able to see that. There are good examples. Doors. This is a huge one. So we take basically one door and we use it everywhere in the model. And then we have a single door, we have a double door. That door does not show you if the light in it, it doesn't show you the particular hardware on it, it doesn't show you if there's, say, paneling on the door. And then we might go and put actual 2D door types, or sometimes we'll put elevation of that single door and draw 2D line work on top of it to show a light or something like that. If you actually model every door, and every specific door has to be built exactly the way it really is in reality, there's quite a bit of extra work that actually makes sure you have all of that content. millwork is another really good example. If you need to make sure that every little pull is modeled, if you need to make sure that you've got the right hardware called out, and that all of this is actually built into your model of your millwork. A lot of the times, we have a generic counter that can stretch a length, and we just pop that in, we stretch it however long we need it to be. It has a counter, it has a backsplash that you can turn on and off, and that's it. But what it doesn't do is it won't show you the correct, say, nosing detail, because we draw that in 2D and we link the view to it. Well, if your contractor's going through your model, you've got to make sure that every counter has a correct nose detail modeled in 3D.
Now, on that, all right. So examples, for instance, I'm speaking here as a person who has watched probably 2 hours of Revit training. So my knowledge is minimal. However, the people in DTS, Tim, etc., are they aware of these, let's call them shortcuts in how you are producing a set or a model? Are they aware of these, they're obviously efficient, okay, gets
Sure.
the job done, like you said, because I have people doing training in the New York office right now who's on the DTS committees running this for us, and they're showing, and maybe it's because he's just doing the beginning level, he's showing us the true way to change, and I'm going to call them attributes, and I know that's probably the wrong word, but to change those selections that's in the library wall type so that you could show the studs go full to deck, but the drywall goes 6 inches above home ceiling. So I thought that's the way it's done, and I can see where over time and over square footage, they will then start to eat up man hours, and I can see your point in being more efficient by not doing it. So I'm wondering, for Nelson overall, how are we training our people who are current employees and not being those being brought in who may have done it differently at other locations? Because it's critical in keeping your project on track with fee.
So one, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I can handle it if you'd like, otherwise I can chime in when you're done.
I was just going to say one thing, Marla, which is that the one I tell you that I'm not totally aware of is I know that my example might have been a lousy example simply because I know that they have really done all of the partition types, and because I don't spend a lot of time in the model myself lately, I may not be up to. So my partition example might have been a lousy example. If we have the content specifically already built, then it's a piece of cake. Yeah, it really comes down to if it's a condition that we have in our library or that doesn't exist and that somebody would have to build extra on top of it, but that it isn't necessarily necessary. But let those guys follow up on that.
And I'll just chime in. This is Brandon. What we typically try to do in our Nelson syllabus is we typically show you how to create a project from start to finish. So this is a ground up, start from nothing, draw or model. And the reason we do that is it allows us to touch on and show them how to use each and every tool within Revit. That's really our key method or our key objectives in the basic training, in the very beginning essentials training, is to touch on every tool that's available in Revit and get that familiar with what it does. What we do, though, is, like, for example, we do have a whole section in our essentials training showing how to import CAD files. In that importing CAD files section, we touch on things like, well, how can we maybe create hybrid AutoCAD Revit hybrid models so we can use the AutoCAD background to some extent to cheat it, to save us some time. But essentially, the essentials training, we try to spend as much time as we can showing how all the tools work within Revit, and they get an understanding of how it works. And a lot of times we do touch on the cheating a little bit, but really the main objective for us is teaching how to use the tool in its entirety.
Okay, Brendan. So, for instance, I know that we're just, we're doing high-level training because that's why I'm involved, because I won't be getting into the same as someone like a project architect or a job captain who's actually working on drawings. So when that happens, at that detail level, so to speak, for the people who are actually producing drawings or building metal, I should say, will they be taught these shortcuts so to speak, and efficiencies based on what Boston has learned and realized that will add to the efficiencies of the profitability of the project?
Yeah, we do touch on those a little bit during the training. Otherwise, that's really where we do have that DTS committee, and this is what Ian is part of. And what we're trying to do and what we're trying to foster in this DTS committee is to provide a common forum for each spokesperson, each DTS representative in each major office. So Ian is one, Dustin in Atlanta, Steve Golisano's in Philadelphia, Ann is in Dallas, I'm in Minneapolis, Tim is in Chicago, and we really are encouraging. We foster these types of efficiencies and ideas within that committee, and we really encourage these people to go back to their offices and kind of
and disseminate it. That's a great approach. I just wanted to know that everybody was, tying this all together because it overall affects profitability, obviously.
Correct. And that's really where the DTS team can come, this DTS committee, where we can bring those efficiencies. Oh, and I've got Krista is in Boston. She's in this committee as well, so we do have Krista representing Boston in this committee. So we all bring our efficiencies together. We all bring our knowledge, our obstacles, our stumbling blocks, our successes into our committee. We share it with one another, and we really do encourage each and every one of us to go out to our offices and kind of, again, spread our word, if you will.
I have another question, Jonathan, regarding this contractor request for the model. Sure. I've always heard that Revit's great because you can get your material, square footage and linear footage, and you can do cost estimating or budgeting. Our advising client does request that as part of our agreement, whether we go to a contractor to do that or whether we do it. But it sounds like the model would have to reflect all of those levels of detail in order to be accurate, correct?
That's correct. It's only as good as what you put in it. So let me give you an example I actually thought of while you and Bruce were talking a second ago. We don't model wall base. We in a situation where the contractor is going to evaluate it off the model. We take it in finished plans like the rest of the world does. We call it the finished schedule, and then in the actual partition type details that are all 2D, the wall base is shown. But we don't think we've ever modeled it except on the process we've done where the contractor has gotten the model. If you need to do a takeoff on wall base, the only way to do it is to do a takeoff on the actual walls you have, and if you did that, you would get walls that may or may not necessarily be getting base. They may not be in scope. So, yes, it's only as good as the information you've put in, and so we try not to do cost estimating for clients. We get a third party to do it.
Right.
We try not to do takeoffs because
so you try not to use the Revit model to produce that. So, all right, that's a great thing to know. And obviously, it sounds like you don't necessarily bring this up unless it's asked of you to do the project in Revit, and then you ask that key question as far as we releasing a model. If they don't ask you to do it in Revit and we just are, then that's it. And even if the contractor later says, "Oh, you're doing this in Revit, then can you do X, Y, and Z?" It's, I guess, okay to say no because we may not have it modeled 100% to the perfection of detail.
I do it all the time.
So it's okay to admit that. Okay. I just didn't want someone poo-pooing us. Okay.
No.
One other thing I would mention about that as well, this is Brandon again. On top of if the contractor will need to be, if the model will need to be released to the contractor, another thing to be aware of in the onset of the project is what types of visualizations will need to happen with this project, with this model. Now again, I know Jonathan, you covered this already, but I just want to reiterate that that's a good idea. And a good thing to consider at the start of the project as well, because that'll give you a good understanding of what you need to model. Like for example, if we're going to be doing some heavy-duty renderings on multiple parts of the project or a lot of the majority of the project, we can start thinking ahead of time what types of content do we need to create ahead of time, like in terms of the furniture. If we need to model the furniture, and if we get into that much of a detail, you can ask, well, I need to see the base in these renderings. If so, we may need to start modeling the base in those individual views where we're going to be doing rendering. So again, thinking ahead of time for visualization as well is a key thing to think about at the beginning of the project, so we don't get caught with our pants down during CDs when we want to do renderings, and you say, oh, wait, your furniture's in T, well, I want a rendering of this space. Well, now I need to spend the time to create that content at that time rather than thinking ahead of time and maybe doing it during the project. So I just want to make that point as well.
I agree with that.
Another difference would be how you render finishes. So also, if you're getting takeoffs, you need to model the carpet as a, some nominal thickness within.
Well, and John actually is bringing up something. We model carpet, but don't model it for the reasons everybody might think. We use, because our finished plans, we have in CAD, you would know it as a hatch. We know it as a filled region. So you want some type of a delineation of the areas of different types of carpet. So we build a little plane that is like eighth of an inch tall that we put on top of all of the floor slabs to delineate areas of carpet, and they go up in the finished plans. Now, if sending this to a contractor who was trying to use literally, that's not a literal representation of carpet. It's a diagrammatic thing, but it does appear in the model. So it's another good example of like where you need to be careful. The other thing I just thought of, Marla, to sort of add is when you work with engineers working in Revit, changes the whole conversation. And we're going to have another session about engineers where I'll talk more about this. But we're doing several projects for Google, and Google could care less. I mean, as far as they're concerned, we could draw by hand as long as we do it. But because we work in Revit, and 2 of the 3 buildings we work in are waffle slab buildings, we built the waffle slab because our engineers, they need that waffle slab so their model is correct, so that when they run ductwork and things like that, they know where their attachment points are, and they know where all of that is kind of resolved. So that was a case of we built the model because we needed to. The model's never going to the contractor. It's never going to the client. But because we were working with Revit engineers, had we just given them a generic slab, it would not have been as effective to be able to coordinate it. So we
That's
sort of made
something they brought up? Was something they brought up to you?
It was just something we knew. I mean, I knew we had to do it going into it, but it's just the kind of thing you have to think of once you start working with engineers in Revit. You realize that they need the 3D of the building in some cases, and if there's a unique construction, they may need that. Again, depending on your scope. Scope governs all here.
I think the rendering and how much detail you need, it relates back to your thought of, treat it not as like a discipline, but as like when you gave that person a sign of doing the room, what's going to be in that viewport, so to speak, for renderer. They have to build that more level and more intense in the model, whereas others may not be. Other areas may not be.
Correct. Sort of last point on this, and it's a general point that I just wanted to bring up to everybody. Make sure your team milestones your model. We milestone it after SD, DD, CD. And that just means make a copy of it and stash it somewhere on the server so that if there was some reason you had to go back to it, you could do that. One of the powers, I guess, of Revit powerful things is that it holds all these design options. The problem is that by the time you get to CDs on a large project and you got 8 design options in there, it's really bogging your model down. So you want to make sure that, and this is something your Revit model manager should really be doing, is making sure that your team is cleaning out design options, make sure that, and this does not take very long, this is a very, very quick process, but just make sure there are milestones is very important.
You should be going into the deliverables folder within the project folders.
And Brandon, that gets told in the.
Do I need anything like?
For the milestone archiving?
Yeah.
Yes, we do have a section where we do cover milestoning and archiving, and it will be in the Revit standards as well.
Okay.
So the big point I wanted to make on CA is that Revit doesn't really differ significantly from CAD. The only place that it really differs is it is a little quicker to do bulletins and revisions because you are in one file, and obviously everything coordinates. So if you do have some changes, I would say producing bulletins, producing that type of thing is a little bit quicker, but in general, CA does not tend to run us a lot faster by doing it in Revit versus CAD. you still go into meetings, you're still doing submittal approval, and there's not a huge difference. So I would say, in a process difference standpoint, I wouldn't really say there's a lot to really think about there in terms of staffing it differently than you would now.
There's when you're generating sketches, there's a production difference, because as you're generating a sketch and a detail key that's going to a sketch, Revit will often default to the detail tag referencing the sketch instead of the sheet number that the detail's on within the set. So for the operators who are actually the production team working on in CA, there are some steps that need to be done to make sure that things are still referenced properly, so that when we print a full set at the end of the project, that stands alone.
Yeah, some technical things, but I wanted to sort of say high level on it in terms of actual fee and time duration. I don't find it to be appreciably significantly different.
So then, where have I always heard that the CA is more? I guess mind is not the word. Unequal, maybe.
Well, we have fewer mistakes and fewer changes normally.
Okay. That many times we could have captured and didn't, and therefore we would normally absorb the cost of making it right. So therefore we don't hit those situations, so we don't dig into our profit. Okay. Yeah,
I mean, I would say that, but I would say that we look at that happy bonus as opposed to sort of a process improvement.
Okay.
I've got to say, I honestly have not found really any savings with CA process.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, whether you do a good AutoCAD project or a good Revit project, it's going to be about the same.
The key is having a good tight set of documents.
Exactly.
True, even if you're in AutoCAD.
Right. And you can put that information into Revit just as easily as you can put it into AutoCAD.
Right.
Well, I want to put together a quick summary slide. So I would say, in summary, make sure you have a Revit Model Manager on board. Discuss the fin schedule with the Revit Model Manager in a proposal situation. Obviously, I have a long history with Revit, so when I do fees, I sort of have that mentality, but I am going to suggest that DDS is a great resource for this for folks initially, or the person in your office that you're thinking of designating as the Revit Model Manager is a great resource, and I would talk to them about the fee and the schedule and say, these are the kinds of things that we're looking at doing. This might be the fee. Can you look at that and sort of help think through where issues might be or where we might have some challenges? And I think that's a very important part of the conversation, especially initially when you're still sort of getting used to the process. Ultimately, I think what you're going to find is that SD, DD, CD should have relatively similar fees and time durations. For Google, it's almost exactly the same fee. I take the thing and divide it in 3, and that's the 3 phases. Same thing on the schedule. It's usually almost exactly the same. I just said a minute ago, CA with Revit is not a significantly different effort than CA with CAD. If you have a bad Revit model or a bunch of bad CAD files, it makes CA awful. It really has to do with the quality of the product. Maintain design support throughout the project. Just because you're in CDs doesn't mean your designer has nothing to do, because things will change. Our senior designers are involved all the way to the end. There's not a point where I wish there was, but there's not a point where we kind of come off and say, okay, you can't design anything else because now we have to document. Design just keeps going all the way, and changes happen until the day it's going out. And you're going to need production support earlier. So we sort of talked about that earlier, having a well-balanced plan, being able to say, okay, we might have downtime early in the project, and we can take the opportunity, we can get sheets done, we can get ceilings in, we can get power symbols put in, all these kinds of things that are very standard that will evolve with your model. As your model changes, they will change. So you don't really have to worry about kind of coordinating that later.
So, Jonathan, I was going to ask, about basically how all of this schedule and durations and how much we have to front load in the project as opposed to an AutoCAD job,
Sure.
and how it affects the fee per phase. So you're touching on it right here in saying SD, DD, and CD are almost equal. But you also mentioned that by the time you get to CDs, your CDs are 90% complete. So we're missing the fact that then you're still charging a fee equal to what you charge for DD, for instance.
So the CDs, the plans, most plans are about 90%.
Plans. Okay, thank you.
So you're going to spend a lot of time doing in CDs. Number one is drawing elevations.
Right.
Number two is going to be drawing details.
Right, and sections.
Yeah. Coordination and making sure that things are aligned, things like that. You're probably going to be doing things like door hardware, door schedule, making sure that all of that is sort of technically done. You may be doing some notes that didn't get to the initial part. I would say that's where code information, egress. I said all plans, but I should have excluded. We don't do egress plans, for example, until CDs. We don't do that kind of information until the very end.
Typically, in the past, we've always said, okay, CA is, as a ballpark, 25% of your fee.
Yeah.
Sounds like you haven't gotten any efficiencies there, so it still would be similar. So the rest of the job basically takes up 75% of your fee.
Plus minus, I would say, yeah.
Okay, so you're, I guess there's always, priming and due diligence before the SD. So then you're...
I actually usually lump them in together, Marla.
You're taking 75 and you're basically saying everything, if there are main phases, SD, DD, CD, SCA.
Yeah, sometimes I break out bidding, but not always.
Right, 25% each.
Yeah, plus minus, yeah.
Okay, all right. Interesting.
And I do, it's very important. Every job is a little bit different. So, it's not always exactly that. Sometimes it goes plus or minus a little bit in either direction. But I'd say as a general rule, yes.
And depending on levels of rendering, I guess, up front during getting people to buy into a design, there may be more heavily time in that SDDD.
Well, one thing I have to say about that, and this is something that Brandon and I talked about this week, is that our situation is a little bit different because we have so many strong Revit users that, in fact, our folks make decisions on what the most efficient way for them to do things. So we've sort of gone backwards now, and we have more SketchUp work going on here than we used to. Right. Because sometimes folks have that, okay, I can export it to SketchUp, do it, and then bring it back.
Right.
We don't have SketchUp going instead of Revit. We still, so what'll happen is that someone will, so we don't have SketchUp in lieu of Revit. We have someone exports the model to SketchUp. They export all the walls. They export, and they might build a little piece in there that they can do 4 or 5 really quick options, and then when they decide which one they like, they bring it back into Revit and they go from there. They don't do like CAD plan and then a bunch of SketchUp renderings and then go, oh, we're going to bring this project into Revit. It's a little bit of a different process, so I sort of wanted to be careful when I brought up SketchUp because I don't want people to think that our guys are using it instead of Revit. We still build everything in Revit at the end of the day, but we do use it to do some quick studies sometimes when we go out and back into it.
Jonathan, I just want to expand on about fees and how the breakdown between the phases. Along with that, you want to make sure that you're aligning the schedule with the allocation of time and effort as well. A lot of times we run into clients, contractors, project managers who are sort of hardwired to the percentage of time that would be allocated if the project were produced in CAD. That's appropriate to just try and push back a little bit and get yourself the additional time that you're going to need for DD. Because otherwise you're going to find your project teams jammed up to try and get the work done in the DD phase. So you want to make sure that you have that time.
And it happens, you then have to make a further adjustment. I mean, we did a lot of Bank of America work on sort of what I'd call a traditional schedule. And it meant we had to make adjustments. Sometimes, in some cases, we we take fee and we would sort of borrow it across, and we would figure out what the deliverables were and produce just those deliverables, and then have other stuff going on in the background. There's a balance. I mean, if the client is not willing to adjust the schedule to sort of align with your process, we have to, kind of work through that. And it's not always easy, and it definitely doesn't always line up perfectly.
I would think you're also putting a little bit at risk, because should that project for some reason get canceled and they tell you, okay, according to the schedule, you're only to SD, so just bill me for your SD phase, you may actually have, put more people on there to finish it within that small amount of time, and may be over your SD phase.
That's a distinct possibility, and it's something that when I build the fee, I look at that very closely. And there have been times that I probably overpriced schematic design with the idea that I thought it might get canceled.
Okay. So you're covering it to get them in the text we're used to seeing it in, but
yeah.
Okay.
So I would go too high and then know I was going to make up for it on the back end, and I've done that over the years.
Okay.
So just to repeat, I know we only have a couple minutes left. The facts we started from the beginning, hopefully, sort of how these kind of basic ideas related all through today's presentation. And thank you. I appreciate everyone taking the time. I know everyone's time is sensitive, and we do a few more minutes, so if there are more questions, I'm happy to hang on. And as Sue mentioned, and I mentioned, this entire session has been recorded, and I don't know how we're going to make it available. I'll leave that to Sue and Brandon, but it will be available to anyone who wants to watch it again, or anything like that, or even forward it to someone else on your teams who you think it might be valuable to.
I think we'll probably put it on the project delivery portal.
Okay.
So I'll send an email about that. Thanks, everybody, and there will be separate sessions talking about managing with consultants and other things, so look for those being invited in the near future.
Definitely.
Thanks.
Yes.
This was great, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? Happy to hang on for a few more minutes, absolutely.
Or if you think of something after the fact, certainly email.
And please, if anyone has anything like that, feel free to send me an email, and want me to review any plans, or if there are any schedules anybody wants me to look at, I'm happy to do it. I'll give you my uninformed opinion as much as possible.
All right.
Thank you.